Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV's courses live and on demand worldwide, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Their team solution provides access to a supervisor portal for full control over your team's training schedule and group analytics. Visit itpro.tv/enterprise security and use the code ES30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership for the lifetime of your active subscription. To learn more about IT Pro TV's team solution, sign up for a free demo of their supervisor portal. Pony Express. Check out their line of penetration testing devices, including the Pwn Pad, Pwn Phone, and Pwn Pro. For enterprises, there's Pwn Pulse, providing continuous visibility into wired, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth spectrums across all physical locations, including remote sites and branch offices. For all those hard-to-reach places, there's Pony Express. Visit them on the web at ponyexpress.com. Quest Software has solutions that allow you to add an additional layer of security to your Microsoft environment. To learn how they can help you protect and detect changes in your environment, please go to quest.com/MPM. Welcome back, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. A couple of quick announcements. Cyber Reason is sponsoring a webcast. Myself, Joff Thayer, and Ross Rastici from Cyber Reason will be talking about how to detect indicators of compromise in your environment using various methods and techniques, including threat intelligence, some of the limitations of the existing techniques, and then Ross is going to get into how Cyber Reason helps its clients with this issue. It's going to be a lot of fun. Make sure you check it out, securityweekly.com/Cyber Reason. Providence HackCon is happening. HackerCon is an event that's being hosted here in Rhode Island on October 21st in the Providence Public Library. If you feel passionately about getting the youth today involved in cybersecurity, you should come to this conference hosted here by Security Weekly in collaboration with Roger Williams University. And we're inviting all of the Cyber Patriot students here in Rhode Island to come to this event and opening up to the public, anyone who wants to come hang out with us for a day, and hear talks from myself, Doug White, Ben Jackson, and Ron and Cindy Gula will be there as well, offering tips to our youth and anyone who wants to get involved in cybersecurity. So make sure you check that out, securityweekly.com/Prov HackCon. All right, I'm going to go back up. I did this wrong. It's backwards in my teleprompter. We're going to talk about, of course, cloud security. This is a topic that Matt and I have talked about a lot, actually. Securing the cloud is, of course, all the rage these days. Many vendors are now offering services in this arena, and rightfully so, because getting a handle on your services that are now hosted in the cloud is no small chore. Most organizations use some form of software as a service, from one of the original Salesforce all the way to smaller offerings like we use GoToMeeting here at Security Weekly. And everything else in between. Enterprises and the mid-market, as we were talking about earlier, especially the mid-market, are using these cloud-hosted services. Now, some organizations still shy away from software as a service. However, it's really standard operating procedure for most. When the software isn't hosted in your environment, how do you secure it? Matt, I'll turn it over to you to start this conversation.
Well, first, I think we have to just make sure we understand what cloud security means, right? Because I think there's a lot of underlying pieces. At the highest level, software as a service, kind of where I think we'll spend most of the time, and that is someone offering software out on a cloud platform as a service like Salesforce or GoToMeeting. But there's other kind of cloud security offerings out there too, which focus on the platform as a service or the infrastructure as a service layers as well. And there's differences across those, because if I'm running my stuff in AWS as an infrastructure as a service, I have a lot more visibility and control into an IaaS than I would into a SaaS, for example. So I just wanted to talk about kind of the different levels, because there's solutions that are pointed at various ones that we might get into. So I figured we kind of level set.
There's one in the middle there, of course, that we can't ignore, and that's the application layer as a service, which I think is still going to continue to catch on. I have the application and I manage that, but I don't want to manage the infrastructure. I want to maybe have less control, or not want less control, but I'm going to have less control of the underlying infrastructure, and I just want to host my application. We see this a lot with Docker and containers. From what people
Right.
tell me, I mean, some people are doing it. Others have told me like it's really not ready for prime time. Like you want to host your container somewhere. However, we fast forward a few years in the future. That's just really where your applications are going to live, and it's going to take out much of that infrastructure maintenance that we see today.
Right. I actually had this debate last week. We were having a conversation, and where does container as a service sit, right? And that's kind of what you're talking
Yeah.
about here. Is it a PaaS or an IaaS? It actually kind of sits in between. I think is where it's starting to evolve. Amazon's ECS.
Yep.
I originally equated them as platforms as a service, right? The ability to take a platform service of Kubernetes, for example, and be able to run my
Hmm.
applications that have been containerized, and then obviously Google GKE on the other side. But they're not truly PaaS. So we kind of said container as a service kind of fits between IaaS and PaaS a little bit. But yeah, there's a whole evolving space with what Docker and Kubernetes and containers are going to do into the space. They have some of the same issues as a PaaS, where you don't really have access to the underlying infrastructure,
Hmm.
which traditional approaches are all focused on the infrastructure layer. And when you're running as a container as a service or as a platform as a service, you won't have access to the infrastructure layer. And so a lot of solutions that are out there focused there are going to kind of get locked out eventually. And
Well,
this
yeah,
will
and
continue to evolve. Yeah.
and that limits what you can do from a security perspective. Speaking of containers, if I have a container security or management solution, if I don't have access to that infrastructure, I'm going to be limited unless the service provider offers that also as a service, right? And that depends on how that container security service is deployed.
Yeah, so we're going to go on a little tangent here. I started this tangent a couple weeks ago on SSW, but let
Yeah,
me go
yeah.
back to it for a second, because you're right. This is what's happening right now in the container space, and this impacts, I think, any of the PaaS or SaaS types of offerings in the future. You get limited in what you can and can't do as you move up the type of service you're running. Container as a service, platform as a service, or software as a service. You don't have access to the underlying host. You don't have access to the underlying network. Look, we've been really good in the security industry of network solutions,
Hmm.
endpoint solutions, but they don't play in this new world. And so if you look at containers and in a lot of the container security companies, there's three traditional approaches. And two of them are really focused on the endpoint and the network kind of layers.
Hmm.
And then I'll talk about the third one, which takes a very different approach. Um, the two main approaches for containers is, look, I'll run a kernel agent on the host, because containers have to communicate with the kernel to spin
Right.
up processes, to spin up new containers. So if I'm running a kernel level agent, I have visibility into what the container is actually doing. Now, if I'm running container as a service, I'm not going to be deploying kernel level agents because
Well,
I don't have access to the underlying infrastructure. So
unless your
that type,
provider offers that as a service to you, an additional service to you.
right. So they would have to make it a service available to
Mhm.
run. Or you'd have to buy your own, get your own dedicated instances, run Kubernetes on
Right.
top, and
Right.
manage it all yourself. Then you wouldn't buy a CAS.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of the kernel, what we call under the container level. The next one, which is the most prominent out there right now, is a privileged container that runs beside all the other containers. So a privileged container, again, has access, because what it does is it runs with privileges. It runs with privileged commands, and so it has visibility. And most of them redirect the container communication through them, kind of like a network
Yeah.
sensor
I
in
can see
some
that.
respects, right?
Yeah.
Is all the communication comes through that privileged container, and that's how they can do all the things that they do. And they have full root privileges down to the box. That doesn't scale in a CAS either,
Mhm.
per se, right? Because if you're running as a container as a service, or kind of the extension of platform as a service, how do you protect multiple privileged containers running in that environment. So again, unless the cloud provider is going to allow you to run privileged containers or
Hmm.
have that as a capability, it's potentially limiting. I've been a big believer from day one, and this was part of some of the strategic work we did at Tenable, was that security has to be built into the application, not outside,
Hmm.
not beside it, under it. It's got to be inside of it. So it's not reliant on the underlying infrastructure. So if you're not thinking about how to embed security into your container-based applications, I think you have limited portability in the future.
Yeah,
So there are
certainly.
solutions out there that are starting to go down this embed sensors into the container itself, provide security from the inside out, and therefore, when your containers move, regardless of whether they're running um, infrastructure as a service with your own Kubernetes environment, or if you're running a container as a service, it goes with the container and it
Yeah.
gives you ultimate portability. And so those
I
are the
like that. I like
kind of
that better
differences.
because the one of the powerful part of containers is being able to move them around and have different
Correct.
environment. I mean, we even the small applications we have here, we move them around all the time. Sometimes they're locally hosted, sometimes they're on a developer workstation, sometimes they're up in the cloud. Like we move around because we can, and that's one of the more
And they're
powerful
going to.
things. Yeah.
Yeah, everybody's going to start with kind of a private cloud deployment. Then they're going to move to
Hmm.
public cloud with dedicated instances. And then as these container as a service offerings continue to evolve and become cost effective, then they're going to move them to a CAS. You won't have to make any changes if
Right.
all your security capabilities are built into the container because it ports with it. Where with the other solutions, you're going to run into limitations or you're going to have to redo things, which I think make it harder to protect those kinds of solutions in the future. Anyways, just
Well, I mean, that was a good
side note
overview.
on
Yeah, well, that was a
containers.
good overview of the whole space, actually. When
Because
it
you have the same challenges when we talk about PaaS and SaaS as well.
Yeah. So, but, like, when I have a Salesforce, let's say, or any other purely cloud hosted service that I don't have access to anything but the application, it's not even my application. I'm just, someone has carved out some user accounts, some space for me, and I'm using it. We've talked about how this changes your job as a information security professional. How have we seen that evolve in the past year, Matt? Has it really like pushed the needle, and now security is interfacing with these software as a service even more and in better ways? And how's that changed our jobs?
So I'm going to tackle this from two dimensions because I think both dimensions have to be addressed. One is the third party relationship with the vendor itself providing the SaaS, right? And this is where you get aspects of understanding of the security controls that the third party puts in place. Look, you can't put your own security controls into Salesforce. You, they're not going to let you, right? So the traditional approach has been I'll go out and do an assessment of Salesforce, for example, and understand do they have these policies,
Hmm.
procedures, and these different controls in place. And so this is a traditional third party vendor management kind of discussion, right? And do they have these controls in place? If not, what's contractually bound, what's not, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's variations across all these different providers. So that's one angle that we've seen. And you know, you guys have we've talked to a number of third-party vendors, management vendors on the show that all provide different levels of capability in managing that. The other thing that we've seen continue to evolve, and Tenable did this, years ago, which was how do I validate the configuration of my SaaS environment?
Mm.
There are certain configurations that you control as a customer of your SaaS platform. And so there is an ability to go out and assess those configurations of your different SaaS offerings and determine, okay, do I have some limitations? Am I doing best practice configuration there? Those are the primary two that I've seen. And then you've got this concept of the CASBs that kind of sit at another tier that tries to inspect um, the communication between the organization and the SaaS, right? So they sometimes have some of this configuration capabilities, but they're also monitoring that traffic back and forth and trying to provide additional insight in. But that requires everybody to go through the CASB, right? So if you're a remote user, in order to get the benefits of a CASB, you're going to have to go through the corporate network and kind of go in through the CASB and out to the cloud vendor themselves. So you've seen some of those solutions out there. I'm not a big fan of CASBs because it's very limiting in the way I think people are working more remotely these days. Is, if you have all these external sales folks needing to work in Salesforce or any other solution that's SaaS based, do you want them to all VPN in and then shove them through a CASB to monitor them? To me, it seems a little limiting, but that is another approach that's used here as well.
Yeah, I think we need to take a closer look at actually configuring the software as a service offering and customizing that and monitoring those configuration changes. I've seen a lot of options out there, but I haven't seen a lot of people talking about, number one, attacking that, and number two, doing a really good job of auditing it. And we've seen it in the news. Big company has an S3 volume and they leak a whole bunch of data. Like, to me, that's controlling your software as a service to a certain extent. But that goes right down to, let's say, use G Suite for email, and how you have to manage all of those settings. And there is some management built into that as well. I think Azure and Office 365 fall into the same bucket, in that, like, you basically now, you're not necessarily worried about patching and operating system stuff. You're worried about, how is my SaaS offering configured? Is it prompting people for two-factor authentication? Am I getting the logging? How am I monitoring those logs? And all the same things we do in security, but it's just different now. And I don't see a whole lot of movement in that direction, or at least people talking about how to break that, and also how to fix it and secure those settings. I mean, Google I don't know if you've ever seen Google's capabilities. It's very confusing. Their options are all over the place, but there's seemingly a lot of control there, where I can say, if someone connects to my G Suite service with, this device, I have to require certain things, kind of similar to our NAC conversation. It's almost like they're bringing that right to the software as a service. And when people connect, they have to use this level of two-factor authentication. And then, of course, there's add-ons to those security aspects as well. I can add stuff onto Google and some of the larger providers as well. And then there's, like, you can piece together your software as a service. I started down that path where you can automate things and get, Twitter to talk to Slack and, all these fancy things. But what does that really mean for security?
So there are some solutions out there, but they're very point solutions. So Evident.io is doing this for AWS, for example, right? And they say they do it for Azure, but I think they've primarily been focused on AWS. And then you have Cavern and Cloud Passage, and there's a number of them. And then on the Azure side, you don't have a lot of solutions except for a small company called Cloud Needy, for example. They focus on Azure configuration and Office 365 configuration.
Twistlock too, I think. No.
Yeah, but Twistlock's really they're so back to our container, right? They're a privileged container solution. So yeah, they can kind of do it.
There was another vendor that did
it. No, that's container.
That's containers. I was confused. It's something like that.
Maybe
it doesn't
CloudLock or.
It doesn't sound anything like what they do, but they provide that Azure and Office 365, basically auditing your data and roles and access. Kind of similar to talking about, like, Microsoft doesn't give you great facilities for that, but there's other vendors that are allowing you to manage Azure and Office 365 better.
Yeah, so Cloud Needy, for example, I know because I've done some work for them, is they help identify the configuration settings in both Azure and into Office 365 to make sure it's meeting, the different kind of best practice requirements out there. So they're a solution, and like I said, they overlap into AWS, but a lot of people on AWS. So what do you do for Google? What do you do in Azure? So I think it will these solutions that verify and check the configuration of the cloud, and then that's going to have to get integrated. So I think piece of structure now. You got data centers. You might be running in Azure, AWS. Something has to pull together to continue to manage it and monitor, probably where other solutions start going to have points into a broader ecosystem and not just be a 100% point solution.
Much harder to look at our software as a service and how we can, manage and control it. And I don't, from the configuration aspect, is probably having those discussions with your IT department to say, look, we're going to deploy something, Salesforce looks like Salesforce for our organization. And it's interesting how you execute those in a Salesforce because of limitations. So you have to look at what's available to then which is backwards, right? I don't necessarily want to base my security architecture on just what's available in Salesforce. I want to define it and hope that all of those tools and methods and techniques exist in Salesforce, but they might not. So I think communication is going to be really important when you're rolling these out in your organization.
Yeah, and you're seeing evolution of kind of CIS benchmarks for some of these different SaaS offerings. So you're going to continue to see, hey, these are the settings you can set, and here's what best practice looks like for those. Now what you're going to need is solutions that can validate those best practices and those benchmarks, and then integrate that in with the rest of your security solutions.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt, for appearing on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. It's wonderful having you as always. Thank you to everyone who is listening and watching. And guess what? We'll see you next time on Enterprise Security Weekly.